Congressman, it's great to be chatting with you.
It's an honor to be here.
This is just a quick subway ride down from your district in the Bronx.
Absolutely.
Before we get to the issues here, one of the things I hear from our audience all the time is that politics is so ugly. Has it always been this bad? And you're in the middle of it, and you've seen some of your colleagues in Congress throw their hands up and say, I'm done here. I can't deal with this anymore.
Yeah.
How do you approach things? Do you ever have times where you're like, I'm done here? I should begin with, what inspired you to get into this profession, and what keeps you inspired?
Sure. Well, it's worth noting that vicious partisanship is as old as America itself.
Right.
I mean, Alexander Hamilton died at the hands of a duel.
Yes.
On the part of Aaron Burr. So
right. I like to remind folks that they had competing newsletters. I mean, they dropped some real dirty things on each other.
Back then, journalism was truly propagandistic. These were just organs of the political parties. So I think we all suffer from presentism. We assume that the present is more unique than it actually is. And probably the most overused term in politics is unprecedented.
Well, it's also the most overused term in media.
Yes.
Yeah.
But look, I feel like there are few areas in life that can have a greater impact in improving people's lives than the government. I mean, when you're a member of Congress, you're part of not only the legislature for the United States, but the most powerful legislature in the world. You can have an impact in improving the lives of 330 million Americans, 8 billion people across the globe. And so you can do an enormous amount of good for an enormous number of people. For me, my inspiration for public service stems from my lived experience. I was born and raised in the Bronx, spent most of my life in poverty. I was raised by a single mother who had to raise three of us on minimum wage, which in the 1990s was $4.25 an hour.
Wow.
And the most formative experience of my life was growing up in public housing. I actually lived in a public housing development right across the street from Trump Golf Course. And as the golf course was undergoing construction, I kid you not, it actually unleashed a skunk infestation. So I tell people I've been smelling the stench of Donald Trump long before he became president. But I grew up in public housing, which was so chronically underfunded that it had a capital need of $80 billion and counting. And so the experience of slum conditions in public housing is what inspired me to get my start as a housing organizer. And then at age 24, I took the leap of faith and ran for public office and became the youngest elected official in America's largest city, and then ultimately ran for Congress, and the rest is history.
It's not the normal profile, though, of a member of Congress.
Radically different. Yeah, I do not have a net worth of $1 million, do not come from a political family.
Right, your great-grandfather didn't serve in Congress.
No, I'm the first in my family to be an elected official, let alone a member of Congress.
What does that allow you to bring to Congress? From your lived experience, how has that manifested, in the halls of Congress, the legislation you're proposing, how you work with folks?
So look, I have a unusual background because first, I'm one of the few members of Congress who does not even have a college degree. But what I lack in formal credentials, I make up for in the wisdom of lived experience. I know what it's like to face housing insecurity and food insecurity. I know what it's like to face inequality and poverty. And so I govern from a place of lived experience. And I feel like I have an on-the-ground, street view level of the problems facing many Americans across the country.
In the district you represent in the Bronx, one of the poorest counties in America?
One of the lowest income, yeah.
Lowest income. What can your district, or the experiences that the folks who live in your district have, what do they tell you about the country writ large?
Look, the median voter in my district is a mother who is struggling to put food on the table, pay the bills, keep their families afloat. And I often feel the political conversation in Washington, D.C. is disconnected from the bread and butter concerns of people in places like the Bronx. People want government to focus on the issues that matter, which is lower cost, lower crime rates, safe streets, secure borders. And there are moments when Washington, D.C. comes off as out of touch, tone deaf, and we're caught in an ivory tower.
Yeah, that was I noticed one of your tweets after the election. The working class is not buying the ivory tower nonsense. Well, you specifically said that the far left is selling, but all Democrats have one of the reasons that the party is now in the minority in the House, the Senate, the White House, even the Supreme Court is a conservative majority. What do you think Democrats have misunderstood?
Look, we have to reclaim our roots as the party of the working class. We've lost touch with the working class. I felt there were two reasons we lost the election. The first was inflation. right? We saw the highest inflation in more than 4 decades. And when you're a party presiding over inflation, when you're blamed for whatever happens under your watch, inflation is a political death sentence. The second was the border crisis. There was, in 2022, there was a massive wave of migration whose impact was felt not only at the border, but also in cities like New York, whose shelter system and social safety net and municipal finances were completely overwhelmed.
But the city spent billions.
We spent $10 billion in the span of 3 years. And I remember a poll in December of 2023 indicating that 85% of New Yorkers were concerned about the border crisis and the implications it had for New York City. And the Biden administration waited 2.5 years before issuing an executive order restricting migration at the border. And by then it was too late. We had lost the issue, and Republicans had effectively weaponized the issue against Democrats. And it was a factor contributing toward our defeat in November.
What do you make of how Donald Trump has approached the border, given how key it was to his victory?
I mean, Donald Trump has swung the pendulum too far to the right.
Yeah.
He has
It's something, by the way, Joe Rogan actually said on his podcast this week.
But everything about Donald Trump is extreme and excessive. But, Donald Trump has been deporting, hundreds of Venezuelan migrants without due process to a maximum security prison in El Salvador under a 227-year-old statute known as the Alien Enemies Act, which dates back to 1798.
Right, John Adams signed that into law.
And for me, of all the abuses of the Trump presidency, I mean, nothing is more dangerous than the war on due process. Without due process, nothing prevents the president from labeling anyone a non-citizen gang member and abducting you in the dead of night and deporting you to a foreign prison to be tortured. Like, the due process is based on the recognition that the federal government is every bit as corruptible and fallible as human nature itself. The federal government can err, it can falsely accuse, it can abuse its power, and due process is what protects us from false accusations and abuses of power on the part of the government. And if we lose due process, we lose everything. I mean, the founders referred to habeas corpus as the great writ, because the founders understood that habeas corpus is not one right among many. It is the fundamental right from which everything else derives.
It seems, though, pretty clearly that the White House likes this fight. They see this as a fight that they relish in having. They liked the pictures of Senator Van Hollen with Abrego Garcia in El Salvador. Yep. And they want to make the argument that, look, Democrats, you ignored the border and you seem to care more about folks who came across the border illegally than you care about the Americans who are either victims of crime related to, illegal migrants, or just generally speaking, you care more about that constituency, undocumented migrants, than you care about American citizens. But my question there is, do you have a warning to fellow Democrats that you have to tread carefully on this issue?
It is certainly true that immigration historically has been a winning issue for the Trump administration, and the economy has become a losing issue, especially in the wake of his tariff policy. But I feel due process is so foundational to who we are as a country and who we should be as a country that it's worth defending. It's an issue that transcends politics for me. And I'm a centrist on immigration. I felt the Biden administration swung the pendulum too far to the left. We should have secure borders. We should have an orderly process of immigration. But the notion of deporting anyone without the slightest semblance of due process in violation of a judicial order, that's not about immigration. That's about the rule of law.
So as far as you're concerned, if the Trump administration said moving forward, and it sounds like we're getting this from the Supreme Court as well, that everyone does have to go through due process, you're okay with deportations proceeding and him both deporting folks who have committed crimes here and folks who are just here illegally who haven't committed crimes, as long as they go through due process?
I would prefer to focus on public safety risks, right? But if you are an undocumented immigrant who poses a public safety risk, then yes, you're fair game for deportation. Everyone is entitled to due process. But if there's a public safety risk in due process, then I have no objection.
You've introduced what you're calling the Rescue Act.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you hope that legislation will do, and whether there's any libertarian-leaning Republicans that you think might climb aboard there?
I anticipate no Republican support because the Republicans are unquestioningly deferential and obedient to Donald Trump. But
though you are starting to see signs. I mean, like the Republican congressman from Nebraska, Don Bacon, is sort of like
Don Bacon is an outlier.
Yeah,
because he's one of 3 House Republicans who's in a district that Kamala Harris won.
Got it.
And he's just uniquely independent, but he's the exception, not the rule.
Got it. So as far as the legislation that you've put out there that you anticipate no Republican support, which means it's not going anywhere, what is it, and what do you hope, like, at some point, if Democrats have the majority, when Democrats have the majority again, its passage will mean?
Look, the Trump administration is essentially conspiring with the government of El Salvador to unlawfully detain people in violation of judicial orders here in the United States. And so if there's a foreign government like the government of El Salvador that's conducting an unlawful detention that violates a U.S. federal court order, there should be geopolitical consequences. There should be a suspension of diplomatic relations, trade relations. We have to leverage whatever tool we have to force compliance with the rule of law here in the United States.
Staying with immigration here, as you started to see signs that Democrats were sort of losing that issue, what were you saying to your colleagues? What were you saying to Democratic leadership? Did you have a line into the White House there in terms of, hey, I'm hearing that, X, Y, and Z, we might need to refocus or shift how we're approaching this?
I think my basic concern is that the far left of the party has outsized power over the messaging and policy making of the Democratic Party. And the Biden administration was too responsive to the far left of the party.
You find that surprising, given Biden's sort of where Biden came from and the way Biden ran?
I think he was a shell of his former self when he was president. So, but, he went too far in catering to the left. And when he issued the executive order restricting migration at the border, there was a poll done on the popularity of the executive order, and it found that the executive order was broadly popular. Like overwhelming majority of Americans, Black, white, Latino, and Asian, approved of the executive order restricting migration. And so if the executive order was effective and popular, why did he wait 2.5 years before issuing it? And the answer is that he was living in fear of the far left. I mean, the far left had outsized power over policymaking in the Democratic Party, and that's what cost us the 2024 election, in my view.
I'm so interested to hear from in your district when you talk to folks in the Bronx about immigration, about the border. What do they tell you? And you are from a very heavily blue district, very Democratic district. You won with 3/4 of the vote. What do folks there say about the issue?
Well, what they're saying now is different from what they said. I mean, now there's a sense that Donald Trump has gone too far, both on immigration and the economy. But a year ago, there was concern about the destabilizing impact of the migrant crisis.
In your district as well.
The expenditure of $10 billion on the migrant crisis in the span of 3 years. The stories about, moving migrants into hotels. I mean, that was poorly received in parts of my district.
Because the feeling was that that's money that could be better used for folks in the district.
And it was just people, the American people have an allergy to incompetence. When George W. Bush was incompetent in managing Katrina, he never recovered. His poll numbers collapsed. When Donald Trump was incompetent in managing COVID-19, he lost re-election. And I thought our incompetent handling of the border crisis did cost us the election. I think if you swing the pendulum too far to the right or to the left, or if you're seen as incompetent at governing, the American people are going to punish you. Your
neighboring district is AOC's district.
Yes.
She's been on a tour with Bernie Sanders. They've gotten some large crowds.
Yeah.
They say that the solution to Democrats' woes, Democrats being in the minority, is what they're selling. Curious as to how you view what they've been calling for. And it's come, we were talking just before we hit record here about some of the various books and solutions that folks have proposed for the Democratic Party. And we're about 100 days in, as we speak here to the Trump administration. Where do Democrats stand? What do you make of the solutions that she and Bernie are selling and some of the others that are out there?
Look, I think we as a party are united in opposition to Trump. Like we're united in defending our democracy, defending principles like due process against Donald Trump. But there are differences about how to effectively govern the country, and that's healthy. Like we are a big tent. We're a widely varied coalition that ranges from the Squad to the Blue Dogs. And that kind of viewpoint diversity is not a weakness, it's a strength. Unlike the Republican Party, which has become a cult of personality around Donald Trump, we're an ideologically diverse political coalition.
Are you concerned in any way about the sort of movement towards the left there? Do you think that like what could happen to the Republican Party could also happen to the Democratic Party? I talked to some members, some of your colleagues who, are concerned that, when you lose enough elections, that your side may want to go to more extreme solutions or politicians in order to, get elected again.
I feel we're well positioned. I'm actually optimistic about 2026. Donald Trump is uniquely unpopular. He's the only president since 1937 whose approval ratings are underwater in the early months of his administration. And the Republican Party under Donald Trump has a history of performing poorly in midterm elections. He lost seats. The Republicans lost seats in 2018. The Republicans underperformed in 2022. And I expect Republicans are going to be held accountable in the polls in 2026 because of the extremes and excesses of Trump's presidency.
How much do you have to do in order to make sure that happens? Or you might have heard like James Carville, the Clinton advisor's approach, which is like Democrats just need to like sit back and let Trump do his thing, versus others who might say, what I need to hear from Democrats, and we hear this from our audience all the time, is like, what are you going to do besides oppose Trump? Like, what are you going to do? What is your 3 solutions? What are your 5 solutions? Like, is that something you think Democrats is that something you're working on? Like, what is the Democratic argument besides we're not going to beat Trump, or our role in 2026, if we have a majority, is just to block what he's doing?
It's important to block. I mean, look, he is attempting to. Congressional Republicans and Donald Trump are attempting to defund Medicaid in the tune of up to $880 billion. We have to block that. Like Medicaid is the leading health insurance program in the United States, particularly for the lowest income. It's the leading long-term care insurance program.
You don't believe him when he says he's not going to touch it.
He could. What he says is one thing. What Republicans have done legislatively is something else. House Republicans passed a budget resolution authorizing up to $880 billion in cuts to Medicaid. And I represent a district that has the highest percentage of residents enrolled in Medicaid, 67% of my district. Like more than 50% of the clinical visits and emergency visits and outpatient surgeries, more than 70% of the children, 80% of nursing home residents, 90% of baby deliveries are covered by Medicaid in my district. And so, yes, it's critically important that we resist and block any attempt to eviscerate one of the most important social safety net programs in our country.
So it's more of a, when you talk about your agenda in 2026, it's more of a defensive strategy because you're limited in terms of what you can do on offense.
Yeah, we need to have an affirmative vision for moving the country forward, but resisting the worst of Donald Trump and protecting the social safety net should be front and center, no question.
You also sit on the House Financial Services Committee.
I do.
We've been following, and you've been closely following, the tariffs. I want to ask about the overall goal, which is the president says we're going to bring manufacturing back to this country. Do you share the general vision and just oppose the tactics? Or do you think that it's long gone are the days that the U.S. can be a manufacturing hub?
Well, the question is what kind of manufacturing? And look, it seems to me Donald Trump is on a kamikaze mission to crash the U.S. economy. 48 hours following so-called Liberation Day, we saw the evaporation of $6.6 trillion in wealth within 2 days.
During the stock market drop.
The stock market.
Yeah.
But the stock market not only affects the wealthiest among us, it affects 150 to 170 million Americans who are either directly or indirectly invested, who have pensions, IRAs, Roths, who are directly affected by the instability and volatility in the stock market. I think his policy has been deeply destructive. Keep in mind that half of all imports in the United States are inputs into American manufacturing. And so if you impose a tax on those inputs, you're not strengthening American manufacturing, you're weakening it. And we should ask ourselves, what's the kind of manufacturing that we want to bring back to the United States?
What would you want to bring back here?
So I'm concerned that we in the United States have become dangerously dependent on China for critical minerals, rare earth elements, active pharmaceutical ingredients, clean energy technologies.
Yeah, and that's something we hear from people on both sides. And we hear that from a lot of Democrats.
Yeah, so we need to create a strategy for eradicating those dependencies. But for me, the right approach is the CHIPS Act, right? The CHIPS Act is industrial policy that invested $52 billion to create an advanced semiconductor industry here in the United States.
This was passed during the Biden administration.
Yes, and it's leveraged hundreds of billions of dollars in private investment. That's a much more effective approach than imposing a $600 billion tax on every foreign input entering the United States.
The White House likes to point to a number of companies, and they send it out and they update this list from the White House that have announced in recent months and weeks that they are moving or creating a new factory here. The White House has pointed to the fact that, tariffs have been effective in getting some of these companies to say, you know what, we're going to put our next plant in Indiana or Missouri instead of Mexico.
History is repeating itself, right? In 2018, Donald Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, particularly from China. Those tariffs created about 1,000 jobs in the steel industry, but cost us 75,000 jobs elsewhere in American manufacturing. So the cost of the tariffs outweighed the benefits by a ratio of 75 to 1.
Why did we lose those other jobs?
Because there are a whole host of downstream industries that rely on steel as an input. And if you're raising the cost of those inputs, it's going to create job losses in those downstream industries. So it's not if you're imposing tariff on steel, it's not enough to look at the steel industry. You have to look at all the industries, including housing, that rely on steel as an input. Right? Or Donald Trump imposed tariffs on everything. If you impose a tariff on coffee, you're not going to bring coffee manufacturing or production here to the United States.
Right, 99% of coffee comes from abroad.
Right. You're simply going to make it more expensive and less available to American consumers. What sense does that make? What sense does it make to impose a tariff on a territory that has no human population? What sense does it make to impose a tariff on the UAE or the Netherlands, with which we're running not a trade deficit, but a trade surplus? Or impose a tariff on Lesotho and Cambodia, countries that are too impoverished to buy as much from us as we buy from them? Just the policy was indiscriminate and nonsensical. It was wrong both in conception and in execution.
I want to get to foreign policy real quickly. Yeah. You've been very outspoken on the Israel-Gaza war. I've seen you speak on it a number of times.
I rarely speak about it. So.
I wanted to make sure that today's a day that ends in Y, and if you haven't addressed it yet today, then we'll talk about it. I can
come out of the closet about my actual views on Israel.
Well, speaking of I want to begin because I think, and I know you've gotten this question a few times, but how does a progressive gay Puerto Rican congressman from the Bronx become one of the fiercest fighters for Israel? How a Zionist, especially at a time where it's never been more challenging to espouse that.
I've been traveling to Israel for about a decade, so it's
before you went to Congress.
Long before I went to Congress. I traveled to Israel for the first time in February of 2015, so it's been more than 10 years. But for me, my response to October 7th is about basic morality. We saw a terrorist organization, Hamas, systematically murder and maim and mutilate and torture and abduct thousands of Israelis. And that should be denounced as barbarism and terrorism. And Israel has every right to defend itself. Israel has the same right to defend itself against Hamas in the wake of October 7th, just like the United States had a right to defend itself against Al-Qaeda in the wake of 9/11. Self-defense is the right and responsibility and raison d'etre of every nation state on earth. And Israel should not be an exception to the rule of self-defense.
What do you say to, especially a lot of the fellow Democrats, increasingly who say that, well, Israel's gone too far with their self-defense, and Israel needs to be doing more to ensure that the Palestinians can, have their own state?
Look, no country prosecutes a war perfectly, and we should all be horrified by the wretchedness of war. But my view is one's outrage should be directed at the cause of the war. When it comes to World War II, our outrage is not directed toward the United States or Britain. It's directed toward Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. because those were the causes of the war. There would be no World War II without Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The same logic applies to the war in Gaza. There would be no war in Gaza were it not for October 7th and Hamas perpetrating the deadliest day against Jews since the Holocaust. And so moral responsibility ultimately lies with the cause of the war. Israel did not choose to go to war with Hamas. The war was imposed upon Israel by the barbarism of October 7th.
What do you think? The president has laid out his vision for Gaza, the Riviera of the Middle East. The Arab countries are getting together. Everyone's trying to figure out kind of what the next step needs to be.
Yeah.
You've traveled there. You're more steep in these issues than a lot of members of Congress.
Yeah. Although I'm not clear I have a solution, but I think if we replace the regime, if we replace Hamas with a regime that's able and willing to make peace with Israel, then it will lay the foundation for sustainable peace in the future. But as long as Hamas remains in power, there will never be peace for Israelis and Palestinians, and there will never be security for Israel. And Hamas will attempt to plant the seeds of an October 7th repeat, something that Israel cannot afford.
There was a time not so long ago where Israel wasn't a very partisan issue. You talked to the majority of Democrats, majority of Republicans. And, it's been striking seeing some of the polling of late. There was a poll recently, Gallup, 60% of Democratic voters now side with the Palestinians, 20% of Democrats with Israelis. What do you think has happened on your side, in your party?
I reject the notion that the Democratic Party is monolithically anti-Israel and the Republican Party is monolithically pro-Israel is more of a caricature than a fair characterization of the political
Even
reality.
with that polling?
I think what matters are the votes in Congress, right? The fact is that take the National Security Supplemental, which appropriated, $14 billion for Israeli self-defense, more than any other legislation in American history. That legislation would have never passed without Democratic votes. Like the overwhelming majority of Democrats and Republicans are pro-Israel and support legislation that has advanced Israel's security in its moment of greatest need. So for me, the votes in Congress matter more than polling, which changes rapidly over time.
You've been very outspoken, and you've also gotten, literally people running after you on the street, backlash online, backlash in person. What's that experience been like?
Look, it's painful. I mean, I've chosen the path of most resistance, but in politics, you have to do what you think is right. And I feel like the Achilles heel of most elected officials is a pathological need to be loved by everyone.
Yeah.
And I thank God every day that I'm so socially ill-adjusted, I have no need to be loved by anyone. And when you give up the need to be loved, that's the beginning of leadership. So I'm willing to stand up for what I believe in, even if it means standing alone, and even if it means facing ostracism and opprobrium from the far left of my party.
Do you get any of the backlash from your own constituents in the Bronx?
It's mostly from outside my district, yeah.
Sticking with New York here, I just want to end here. We have a mayor's race happening. You were one of the first major endorsements for Andrew Cuomo as he returns from being governor, coming to be mayor of New York. You said that New York doesn't need a nice guy to get things done here. What do you mean by that?
For me, the most important virtues in political leadership are competence. Do you have the competence to run a government? And courage. Do you have a courage to stand up to the extremes on both sides, the far left and the far right? And, the competence of Andrew Cuomo is not a matter of faith, it's a matter of fact, right? The redevelopment of Moynihan Train Hall is a fact. The redevelopment of LaGuardia Airport is a fact. The construction of the Mario Cuomo Bridge is a fact. And so Andrew Cuomo is one of the few executives in the 21st century who's genuinely a great builder of New York. And that's the kind of competent leadership that we need now more than ever.
I mean, you're a lifelong New Yorker.
Yeah.
How did the city get to this point? Where we all have to feel like we're on the subway. I'm scared to wear my AirPods now, head on a swivel, for the rare situation that somebody, there's several incidents of being pushed and et cetera. How did we get here?
Look, we swung the pendulum too far to the left on issues of public safety. I mean, New York has the most dysfunctional criminal justice system in the country. We have a policy of releasing repeat violent offenders, which shockingly has led to a cycle of repeat violent reoffending. So since 2019, there's been a 150% rise in the number of repeat offenders for felony assaults. more than 80% for robberies, more than 60% for burglaries, more than 60% for shoplifting, more than 100% for grand larceny auto, more than 70% for grand larceny. I'll cite one particular case. There was a case of Jamar Banks, who stabbed 2 people on New Year's Day. Jamar Banks had an extensive criminal history of 54 repeat offenses, which included a shooting, an attempted murder, multiple stabbings, multiple acts of domestic violence. And despite his extensive criminal history, he was released back onto the streets, where he went on to commit more crimes against more innocent New Yorkers. And here's the problem. New York is the only state in the country that refuses to consider, that prohibits judges from considering the public safety risk of repeat violent offenders. If you're a judge, you can only consider flight risk.
What was the argument for that?
For me, there's no good argument against it because we're the only state that has that requirement. And frankly, if you were to present to the people of New York a referendum, should judges have the authority to consider the public safety risk of repeat offenders, 80 to 90% of New Yorkers would say yes. Blacks, whites, Latinos, and Asians, like New Yorkers across every background, would say yes because it's a matter of common sense. But the trouble with our politics is that common sense has become dangerously uncommon in City Hall, in Albany, and in Washington, D.C.
And one of the issues the Democratic Party has been facing is that there is a general feeling that when you look at New York, a state with a blue supermajority, California, some of these other places, the feeling is that Democrats can't govern.
Look, there's a new intellectual movement that has taken hold on the left in Democratic circles known as abundance.
Right.
And for me, at the core of the abundance movement is a simple premise that if Republicans are going to be the party of less government, we should not be the party of more government. We should be the party of better, cheaper, and faster government. That we in the United States should be a nation not of bureaucrats, but of builders. Because the Democratic Party historically has been the party of building. Like, we're the party that electrified rural America. We're the party that has built great infrastructure, and we need to reclaim those roots.
Do you think that that's happening? Do you think that, I know it's in conversation, but do you see that happening in practice there?
I think admission is the first step toward recovery, and we're beginning to see an admission that there is a crisis of blue state and blue city of governance that we have to overcome. But right now, the priority is resisting the worst of a Donald Trump presidency because he is waging war on due process, on democracy, on our economy, and we have to protect the foundations for American society.
As you know, there's a governor's race coming up here in New York State.
I'm well aware.
I've seen your name circulating. Yeah. Curious as to where you are in your decision making and how soon you think you'll make a decision as to your future.
So it's no state secret that I'm exploring a run for governor. I'll make a final decision after the mayor's race.
At the Democratic primary, or you're talking about after November?
After the Democratic primary, yes.
In June.
Yep. So
this summer you might be...
I'll make a decision either by the summer or September.
And what's going into that decision?
Look, it's if I were to run, I would be giving up a safe congressional seat, which is not something that I wish to do lightly. So, whenever you're running for an office, you have to make assessments about your viability. You have to do polling. There are some practical considerations. You have to, speak with your family. So I never make any decision hastily. I go through a deliberative process.
And as you look at the state of New York, and I know that you've been traveling a bit around the state, what is it that you think New York has been missing? We've had pretty consistent Democratic leadership here for a while. What needs to be done that especially hasn't been done in the past couple of years?
We need leadership. No state saw a greater swing toward Donald Trump than New York. And that to me was not a coincidence. That was a consequence of failing governance at the state and local level. The majority of New Yorkers are dissatisfied with the direction in which our city and our state are heading. New Yorkers are paying more and more for less and less. We feel our public safety, our quality of life are declining. Our costs and our taxes are rising. We're losing lower income working class New Yorkers because of the affordability crisis. 20% of the young Black population has disappeared in the past decade. We're losing higher income New Yorkers who are fleeing the city for Florida. And I'll give you one example. In 2015, the New York State budget was $142 billion. 2025, it is $252 billion. There's not a single New Yorker anywhere who has seen a $110 billion improvement in the delivery of government services. And so we're at a crossroads. We can either double down on a broken system and do the same thing over and over and over again and expect a different result, or we can usher in a new generation of leadership.
And is that the feeling you get when you look at the current governor?
I think the current governor is fundamentally ineffective, no question. Yeah, there's no one who thinks that New York has anything approaching the best governor in the state. So.
Congressman, thanks for chatting.
Of course, an honor to be here.